Thanks everyone for being here. I have a lot of stuff to talk about today, and perhaps not as much time to do it in as I would like. So I'm going to attempt to speak somewhat quickly, and depending on what this timer here tells me, I may decide in the middle to skip ahead over some things in order to make time for Q&A. And I just ask you to bear with me on that. And if I skip something that looked interesting to you, go ahead and ask a question about it later. So the name of this talk is How and Why. And what that means is I feel like when I come to a conference like this, whether it's an independent conference or a mainstream conference, what I see are a lot of discussion about how kinds of things, right? These blue questions down here are how questions. If there are sort of new people in the room, it's how do I get into the game industry? Or how do I get started as an indie instead of as a mainstream person? Or, hey, I'm an indie and I've kind of got this game, and how do I pitch it to publishers and get a publishing deal? And you see this basically at every conference all the time. My feeling is that this disregards the entire other half of the question, which we really want to be confronting here, this being an art-oriented conference, which is the why, right? What is my core motivation behind doing all of these things that I'm working so hard on with the how part? In order to look at this from a craft versus art perspective, if you really nail all those issues of game production and business and pitching, you get a strong how, and that makes you a really good craftsman or a craftswoman. But that doesn't make you an artist, right? The art comes from the motivation, from the strong why. And the thing about the game industry today is we have way more craftspeople than we have artists. And that's not necessarily a good thing for a medium that's trying to break into being taken seriously as art. So I would like to address that to the extent that I can. And what sort of the pitch I want to make here is that if you focus on the why instead of the how, a lot of the how is going to fall into line because your motivation is so strong. And I have what I think are some pretty compelling examples of that. Here's two games that I consider to have very strong whys. One of them, Everyday Shooter by Jonathan Mack, a single game developer in Canada. He did all the programming, art, and everything. This was just signed to the PlayStation Network, and it's going to be a PS3 downloadable game. And Flow, which came out earlier this year, again by a small team just out of college. This was both of these teams' first games. They got very good deals on a major console. Like, whoa, how did that happen, right? Most independent developers, they come along and it's like, oh, please, Sony, please even look at my game, right? Give me a lousy deal. I just want to publish it. And these guys got great deals. And I can't announce anything yet, but I'll say that not necessarily from the same people, but Braid got a very good deal as well. I wasn't ready to shop it around, and a publisher called me and said, hey, can we look at your game? And I gave it to them, and they're like, oh, we want to publish your game. Here, have this deal. And I looked at it, and it was the most amazing deal that I could think of. And it was crazy. How did this happen? And what happened was we're at a crucial juncture in the development of independent games where we're starting to see some things that are artistic or that give you a feeling when you play them that is substantially different from what you get from most games, right? So Everyday Shooter, which by the way is playable here at Acme, it's in the Best of the IGF exhibit. You start playing this game and you can tell from the first minute that it's not just an 8-way shooter like Geometry Wars. It has a philosophy to it, right? You play Flow and you can tell Flow has a philosophy, and that makes these games different. It makes them feel like they have a reason to exist besides just being fun. And that's why publishers are flocking to this category of game, right? So these guys started out with a why, and they got the deal part basically handed to them. So this talk is about making that kind of game, notable games that a lot of people are going to talk about as being groundbreaking, not just about, hey, we finished a game and it's kind of fun, right? So we're striving here to make an excellent game coming from a place of deep motivation, which is not exactly an easy thing to do. And to be totally honest, how are we honest about evaluating these things? How do we really know that our game is excellent as opposed to just us fooling ourselves, right? Because it's your baby. It's very easy to be convinced that your baby is beautiful when in fact it's not, right? And how do you know that your motivation really is deep instead of shallow? So I know that there's a spectrum of people in the room. Some people are new to independent games, and some people have been here a while. So I'm going to start with the beginner part, and then I'm going to segue into a more advanced part. So here are these how questions I was talking about that beginners like to ask, right? How do I start out? How do I get a deal? You know, how do I program it maybe? And as I've said, I don't feel that these are very good questions. The answers, you go to an hour talk that tries to give you answers to these, and the actual information that you get is not applicable to improve your situation. It just makes you feel like you heard a lot of talking. So I'm going to give everybody in the room the actual secret to succeeding as a new independent game developer. Okay, here it goes. It's really, you know, it's been kept through the ages, but here it is. The secret is that if you want to be, you already are an independent game developer, right? All you have to do is start making things, even the simplest, most basic things. And a lot of people hold themselves back. They feel like, oh, I don't have the skills, or I don't know enough people to make a team. You don't have to make a team, right? If you're an artist and you can't program, you can make something in Flash. There's lots of Flash games on the internet that have gotten a lot of attention, right? If you're a programmer with no art skills, make a cool game with just programmer art, right? Everyday Shooter, that guy, you know, all the art in that game is algorithmically generated, right? If you're a designer and you don't know how to program, make a board game or a, you know, paper-based game, something even without a computer to hone your design skills, and then learn how to program, because all designers actually should know how to program, but that's a different topic. And that's it for the beginner part of this lecture, but if you were a beginner, now that you know this, you're now graduated to the advanced level, because that's all there is. So now, advanced level, how do you go about being a game developer? Of course, we want to avoid failure. The problem is that most independent developers fail in two major ways. 95%, and I'll say this 95 is a somewhat arbitrary number. I don't know what the actual number is, but it's certainly over 90. So we're going to say 95. 95% of people who start out to develop an independent game project just never finish it. So right there, the 19 out of 20 games never come to fruition. Now, of that remaining 5%, 95% of those get done, but they're just not very good, right? They don't, when a new person picks up this game and tries to play it, they don't see any reason why they would want to play this instead of Gears of War or even some other nondescript indie game, right? So how do we get around these problems? Well, the reason that so many games don't get completed is that games are really big, right? They can take 1 year to 3 years maybe or more. If you start out when you're planning your game and you think it's going to take 1 year to do, it actually is probably going to take 3, right? And if you're starting out and you think it's going to take 3, I don't know, that's just scary. You probably won't ever finish that one. The key is, as an advanced indie, to make sure that you've got the core game development skill nailed down, which is perseverance. Don't ever quit at what you're doing, don't flake, and don't meander, because as long as you're making progress on your project, even if it's really slow, you will finish eventually, and that'll put you ahead of 19 out of 20 games, which is pretty cool. You don't even have to be super productive. All you have to do is be consistent. So I'm sort of renaming these two things here. We have the completion goal, which is to get anything done at all, and the quality goal, which is to make it notable, to make it, you know, a really strong entry in the pantheon of independent games. I just talked about how hard it is to meet that completion goal, but the scary thing is that once we get past that, to get past the quality goal, we need to make the completion goal actually harder to attain, right? Because to get quality, you have to throw away some of the ideas you had because they weren't good enough. You have to throw out some of the programming you did because it's not quite the right thing, and some of the design ideas, and you have to throw away some of the art because it interferes with the gameplay. So you have to be twice as good as that completion goal, as I was just saying, in order to make quality, because you end up redoing so many things over the course of development. How do we know which of those things to throw out and redo? That's sort of where the black art of making a notable game comes in. And it's about, I think, approaching whatever your design vision is gradually instead of trying to jump right there. And as you implement the various things, honestly assess for yourself, did this work? Did this accomplish what I want? Or didn't it, right? And the way, I call that the prototyping mindset, right? And what I would say about this is you want to always be prototyping, right? Even if you think that you're in the production phase of your game and you're just cranking out the art in order to be finished, you should actually be prototyping and considering that stuff as temporary and be willing to replace it if it interferes with whatever you're doing. So what is this whole prototype thing? A lot of you probably know. A prototype is about getting to the heart of your game and understanding it while doing as little work as possible. Because as we said, it can take many years to make a game. And you don't want to get 2 years into the development process of your game before you have it finally playable and you start playing it and then you realize, oh, this actually isn't really fun at all. And you just wasted 2 years, right? So you avoid that by prototyping. You can find out, by implementing the core gameplay in a little mini simplified version of your game, what's the player going to be doing? What are they going to be thinking and feeling like, right? And you don't focus on production values. You don't spend a lot of time on graphics and animations, except to the extent that they're necessary in order to feel the gameplay. And that's kind of a wishy-washy area that it's easy to fool yourself about, like, oh, we really do need this animation, but you know, you probably don't, or whatever, right? So you're eliminating risk early so that you know for sure whether you want to pursue this project for a couple of years or not. So I could say a lot of general things about prototypes, but I like talking about specific examples instead, because then I know that what I'm talking about is real. So I'm going to talk about specific prototypes that I've done, and I'll focus in on various aspects of them to make points. The first prototype I'm going to show is something I did probably in 2004. I don't know. I was coming out of this phase in my life when I'd spent a lot of time on tech and doing 3D stuff, and it was all, you know, everyone in this room who's a high-end programmer probably knows how much incredible amount of time it takes to make game tech stuff work, and it doesn't give you that much time to think about or implement gameplay. So I wanted to go totally in the opposite direction, do the simplest little dinkiest thing in terms of graphics and physics and whatever, and focus on gameplay that was really different, that really gave me a different feeling. And the origin of this game was, I saw the Matrix sequel movies, right? And there's a character in those called the Oracle who supposedly knows the future. And I thought those movies were really terribly written because this character like absolutely does not act anything at all like someone who can see the future. But that really got me thinking, like, what would it be like in reality? Can I make a game, even in a very tiny subdomain, that gives you the feeling like you can see the future? And how well would that work? What would it be like? And so I came up with the idea of this sort of billiards game or pool, or I don't know what you guys call this in Australia, but you're just knocking some balls around this sort of felt surface, and I didn't even make holes to knock them in because it turned out I didn't need them in order to understand what I was going to come to understand from this. But basically, I'm controlling the white ball at the bottom, and I can hit the space bar to knock it, and this meter over here controls how hard I'm going to hit it, and I can rotate to aim. And you can see that there are these 3 balls in the middle that are solid, and then there are these sort of ghosted balls around the edge. And the ghosted balls are, if I take this shot right now, that is in the future where the balls will come to rest. So I can shoot the balls, and they'll sort of knock around, and they'll end up exactly where it said they would, right? Because the game is running all those physics for that whole table every frame, right? I can sort of queue up a slightly more complicated version here and knock it, and you see it happen again. And it's this very creepy feeling, I find, when I sort of get in the mode of playing with this. Yes, they always end up exactly where it says, right? And sometimes it's surprising. You're like, they're creeping slowly, and you're like, how would this ball actually get there? And then it barely touches another one and ricochets off and ends up, and you're like, oh, you know, that's really interesting. So this game gave me what were actually kind of deep feelings that I'd never gotten from another game before. You know, and it was just for this simple amount of programming effort. So from that standpoint, it was a very successful prototype. Now, before I set out to do the programming, I had some ideas about what the actual game design was going to be, right? Because this isn't a game yet. I was thinking, well, since it's going to subtract out the actual aiming skill part out of playing pool, then it's going to turn it into more of a strategy game, right? It's going to be about just choosing where your balls are going to end up, whether they get in the way of pockets or whether they interfere with the opponent's shots. So it's going to be kind of like a turn-based strategy game, but it's pool. That's going to be really cool and like physics-based. That didn't work out, and the reason is that the game is completely unplayable if you're trying to make a plan. And to illustrate that, so here, you know, I'm trying to shoot this ball straight up, and as the player, I want to try and create, say I'm trying to hit the red balls into specific places, I'm trying to create a scenario where the red balls are going to go where I want. And you'll see, as I barely rotate this, wow, you know, like the butterfly effect kicks in because this physics is so crazy and unpredictable that the balls just go everywhere. And as a player, I cannot make a plan. So like this game, as I envisioned it on paper, is totally unplayable. I tried some things, like right now I'm actually pressing little keys that rotate microscopically, like you can barely see the table turning, right? And yet the balls are still freaking out. Like that's how crazy physics is. And I tried to think, like, is there some way to help the player visualize this and make plans? And like, no. There was no way to actually make this into a real game. So I was very happy that I didn't start out by like rendering a 3D pool table and like doing cool sound effects and like licensing Havok and stuff, right? Because that would have been a big mistake, because I would have been screwed. So that's what prototyping is all about. But I love that feeling, that creepy feeling of really being able to see the future and of the future being inevitable, right? And I wanted to make a game about that. And that fed into some other ideas that I had about time, where I started making this game called Braid. So some of the other time-oriented ideas I had were things like, you know, I've always been interested in quantum mechanics, and there's this interesting aspect of that where if you go down to like the fundamental laws of the universe, there's no arrow of time. Like time going forward is the same as time going backward. But that's totally not how we experience the macroscopic universe, like walking around. So which part is the illusion, right? Is it our world or is it the micro world? And what would it be like, you know, if we could create a microdomain where time actually did behave the same forward and backward? What would that be like to play, right? Another one, I had an email conversation with some friends about Prince of Persia: Sands of Time was a game that had come out several years ago, and we all thought that the rewinding in there was kind of gimmicky and not necessarily the right thing. And one question was, well, what if you made a game and you could rewind whenever you wanted and the player would never die? Like, what would that do? Well, it would destroy consequence. Like, if your player can't get killed, all of game design goes out the window and it's terrible and the world ends. But I wanted to try that out and see how it felt. Just see how it felt to live in a world without that kind of traditional consequence. And I decided to do it in as simple of a domain as possible to avoid all those physics problems of butterfly effect and things going crazy. So I figured a Super Mario World style platformer would be a great way to do it. Because the physics are very simplified. There's a simple kind of jump, and you bounce off things, but you generally only bounce off one or two things, and there aren't chain reactions or anything like that. So I built this prototype for this game, Braid, and it was the most creative and productive time of my entire game development career. I was on vacation in Thailand, and like I did this thing for a week. I was conscious that I was going to send this game to some friends and have them, you know, tell me what they thought of it. So I made sure the controls were very prominent. It sort of has this sort of fiction because I like, it's got some typos I just noticed, but this sort of sets up the story. And as you can tell, there are basically no production values here, right? I'm controlling my little guy, and like he doesn't even animate, and I can jump, and the jump is timed really badly, but he can run around, and he can go through these levels, and etc. And I'm going to show you a lot of the time stuff that happens in this in the almost finished version of the game. But I just want you to get the feel for this one, right? So I did this in a week. And like I said, I started out with all those ideas about time. But I implemented the rewind one first because I saw a lot of potential right away. I was thinking about it like, there's all these rules of platformer design that if you've read design literature, you know about. Like one example is you shouldn't have leaps of faith, which is where you require the player to jump into somewhere that he can't see in order to progress in the level. Because there could be like spikes or lava down there and you could die. And if you require the player to jump somewhere and he's wrong about it and he dies, he'll never trust you again. He'll be like, oh, the level designer for this game doesn't know what he's doing and I never know what I'm doing, and this safety net sort of goes away, right? But if there's no consequence of dying, then leaps of faith just don't matter anymore, right? So I suddenly saw a whole bunch of opportunities like that to say things about platform games, and I just ran with it. And I started getting more and more ideas about how to build things into this rewind mechanic, and I eventually threw out all those other ideas that I started the game with, like the arrow of time thing and the seeing the future thing. But this prototype went great. Ideas kept coming and coming, and I'll show you the final result in a bit. But here's an interesting point, which is that if I'd stuck with one of my earlier game ideas and tried to make it work, like that Oracle Billiards, or some of the other prototypes I didn't show because there's no time, there were lots of them, you know, any of those I could have taken them and tried to improve the game design and make it better. But if I'd been working on that, I wouldn't have been working on this, which was the best game that I've ever touched, like in my life. So that seems to conflict with the advice that I was giving you guys earlier about how you have to be dogged and like never quit and always finish things. And the truth is actually a little more nuanced than that, right? It's you should always finish things as long as it's the best thing for you to be working on right now. And how you know that is, I don't know. It's a black art again. I feel like as long as you learn something from a prototype and you have another idea that's maybe at least as good, then maybe it's time to move on. So I'm going to show for a bit where this game ended up. Some of you may have played this because it was in the Best of the IGF exhibit here last year. However, it was a much earlier version of the game that didn't look as good. And it also takes longer to load because it actually has graphics now. So, yeah. I'm just going to use some cheat keys to flip through places. But it's unlocking all these worlds that I can go to. The concept of this game ended up that whereas platformers traditionally take you through like the fire world and the ice world and like all these different scenarios, in here you would go to different worlds and time would behave differently in each one. So, I'll go into the first world here, and I'm sort of using, this is not normally where you would enter the world, but I'm using a cheat door. And this level has the purpose of introducing you to the game. So the goal of the game is to collect these puzzle pieces like this thing that are glowing, and it's too high for me to jump to, right? But it's trying to teach you non-verbally that, hey, you can jump off these monsters and bounce higher, and that's how you can get some things, right? I'm actually going to earlier in the level. This is the first puzzle piece, and you can try to get it by jumping, and you probably, since you're new to this game, end up dying. And you learn very early here that if you die, the game will just pause, and it lets you press shift and undo what you did and try it again. So this game is very forgiving that way, right? You can never lose, you can never die. And the extent of your rewind is also, your rewind ability is also much, I don't know what the right word is. It extends much further into history than in most other games, right? So I can actually rewind, and I can speed it up a little bit, and go back, all the way back to where I entered the level. And actually, you can probably do that. If I've been playing that level for about an hour, I could probably do that. And then, oh, I didn't want to rewind that far. It's a mistake, so I'll go back forward and redo all the stuff. Right? So that was the first thing that I did in this prototype, and I established that as the feeling of the game, right? And everything had to, like, match that. Yeah, I won't go into that any further. It's just hard to explain. But some things you do and they don't fit the game, and some things you do and they do fit the game. So as soon as I implemented that, I came up with a bunch of puzzles that were sort of riffs on the classical platformer, like you can't do this, or this is too hard to expect players to do. Now things are easy, because if you miss a jump, you just try it again, right? The next thing I put into the prototype was, hey, what if there's some objects that are immune to your power to rewind time, right? So in this version, those are denoted by these purple sparkly things. And to illustrate how that might work, I'm going to jump down in this pit and get this key that I need to open that gate up there. But now I'm stuck. Like, this pit is too deep to get out. There's nothing to bounce off. There's no way up. So I can rewind my way out, though. And the key comes with me. And because it's immune to that whole, like, regular flow of time thing. And I just came through this gate, and I can rewind my way back through the gate, and it doesn't close, right? It's sparkling. And this level is supposed to teach you about that kind of behavior, but there's a lot of puzzles that get built out of that. So, for example, here, there are these clouds that you can stand on, and I want to get across there, but there's too much of a gap in this pattern of how they're being fired, right? I just can't make that jump. But these clouds are being fired by these cannons, and one of them is immune to being rewound, right? And all the clouds that it fires are also sparkling and are also immune. And what that means is if I rewind a little bit, some of the clouds will rewind and other ones won't. And they phase shift with respect to each other, and I can actually set them up evenly spaced. And then I can make my way across pretty easily and get the little puzzle piece, right? So that's an example of the kind of puzzles that are in that world. And I was just kind of like on fire when I was doing this prototype, and I was like, well, what if time manipulation wasn't just bound to you rewinding things, right? What if we collapsed it into space? So in this world, if you don't move, time just stands still, right? If you move to the right, time goes forward. and that little monster is walking around in the way that usually happens. And if I walk to the left, time goes backward, right? This is actually, almost this exact level was in my original prototype. I like the idea of Donkey Kong because it forces you to zigzag left and right, which in this paradigm of time behavior means time is going to go forward and backward, right? So guys get shot out of his cannon and sucked back up and whatever. That's kind of cool. And then interesting, conundra arise naturally from this behavior, right? I was looking for puzzles that aren't contrived. I think situations that could arise naturally that would be interesting for the player to figure out. So I want to climb up here, up this ladder to get that puzzle piece at the top. But I can't, because this guy is like blocking me, right? But, you know, the ladder is clear when I'm over here, but just anytime I'm standing at this horizontal position, he's going to be in the way, right? So how do I get past him, or how do I kill him so I can get up to get that thing, right? So that's the kind of puzzle that world's based on. So those three worlds that I just showed you, the fundamental like prototype programming for those was all done in a week. Like obviously this version is a lot more polished and stuff, and I'm using this one instead of the prototype because it's easier to navigate. Like I have all the cheat keys in it and stuff. But you know, all these puzzles were in there, and I sent it out to my friends, and they loved the game. And it was like, well, dude, you have to make this game. And I'm like, all right. I'll show you one more that was not in the prototype, but that was done several months later. There's a few more worlds in the actual game. In this one, so you know, in most of these worlds, when you rewind something, it essentially gets undone, and you get to redo something new. Well, one idea was, hey, if you decide to rewind some things that you did, what if they don't get entirely undone, but they live on in a parallel reality, right? Because like, hey, I've read lots of science fiction and parallel realities and stuff. So what can you do with that? Well, maybe you have these sparkling objects that exist in both realities, right? So this switch here, if it gets manipulated in one reality, it gets manipulated in both, and that gives rise to a wide family of interesting puzzles. So, you know, if I try to solve this in a mundane way, I'm trying to climb up there and get that puzzle piece, and I'm trying to get through the door, but I can't get through. But like, hey, maybe if I go throw the switch, but then decide, actually, I didn't really want to throw that switch, so I rewind, but it still happened in some alternate universe, and now I can actually get through, right? So this is just to give you the flavor of this game. I'm not going to go through anymore, because there's a lot more to say. That was a really great experience. And even after the initial prototype phase, to go back to this always be prototyping idea, I found that the rest of the game, even when I was supposedly in production, was a great test bed for prototyping ideas, because there were all these different worlds with different behaviors of time, and I could play with them independently, right? I could have an idea like, what if, when you rewind, it still happens in a parallel universe, and I could try a couple different ways of making that happen, and see how it fits into the rest of the game. That was pretty cool. You know, there were a couple of modes that got cut because they didn't give rise to natural enough or deep enough puzzles. I won't explain those for now. After all that was done, right, I had the game fully playable from end to end, you know, 85 puzzles in it or something. They were all cool. I still hadn't managed to find an artist for it. This was kind of a historical accident because I wanted an artist at the beginning. Cell phones distract me sometimes. Right, so this game was playable from end to end, and it was time to enter it in the IGF, and it didn't have any art, and I did. And so it won this game design prize, which was pretty cool, right? So people sort of responded to the gameplay, even though it still had programmer art. But then it was time to do the art, and we've been working on that, and because the game was just made out of like blocks, like you saw in that initial prototype, it was actually a little bit better looking at that time. But still, you went through all these worlds that were basically like stone slabs and whatever. But that meant the gameplay was very clear, right? In a platformer, especially a puzzle platformer like this, there's some specific things you want to know, like where can I stand before I fall off this ledge, right? Can I make it across this jump or not? Like, how clear is that to me without having to try and fail as a player? Those are things that make a player very comfortable and confident in the game design, right? And what we noticed when we started adding art to the game was we would screw up some of those things, like, oh, this grass texture makes it ambiguous where you can stand, and it's bad. Or you can't tell in this world the difference between the foreground and the background sometimes, and you have to go bump into things to know if you can walk there. And it diluted player confidence. So because we had this example of what was essentially a later stage prototype without any art, but cool gameplay, that helped us do all the art. And the art was this, again, this third stage like prototyping process of, let's try this style. No, it interferes with the gameplay. Let's try this, let's try that. right? This is another victory I consider for Always Be prototyping, because I really love the way that the game came out in terms of visual art in the end, and it does not interfere with the gameplay. The core gameplay still survives. I'm going to go on and talk about some other prototypes now. So as I said, this gameplay, or Braid was gameplay complete in about late 1995. And early 96, I was thinking about, hey, what should my next game be? And I decided, I like this prototyping thing. I'm going to do it some more. So even though I wasn't done with Braid, these games are multi-year development processes or extravaganzas, right? And it takes so much concentration over so much time to do them. Sometimes you need a break. And so I decided, hey, if I need a break once in a while, I'll just take a week and I'll go do one of these super creative, like super intense. I'm still in the honeymoon phase with this new design and not trying to polish it up. And work as hard as I can on a new thing, and then I'll come back to Braid and work on it some more. And that was highly successful. So I'm going to show you this game called Raspberry now. If I can find it. This game was an attempt to create gameplay that sort of feels like music, which is a vague thing to describe. And I'm going to have to talk pretty quickly once I actually start the game. So prior to that, I'll just say there's a few different channels of variation between what happens in this game. There's what I'm trying to do as the player. We'll shift back and forth between a couple of things. There's like the size of the targets that I'm trying to hit is going to become small and big, and that's going to make me feel different in the way that they move. And the goal of this game was to change those things around in patterns, maybe even call and response patterns, the way music works. So I'm just going to play this for a second so that you can get a feel of it. My goal in this part of the game is to keep the blue dots on the left-hand side and the green dots on the right-hand side. And if they're on the right side, they put out these little green sparkles, which gives me positive points. If they're on the wrong side, they put out red sparkles, and that reduces my score, which is sort of displayed in the upper right-hand corner of the screen. Now the gameplay is shifting, and it's switched into this mode where I'm actually not pushing the dots at all, but I'm trying to touch them and match similar colors with my mouse cursor. And when I do that, they pop and I get points. And now it's shifted back, right? Now I'm playing this move the dots around kind of thing again. And now they're getting smaller, which means that they're easier to push, but they also probably move faster on average, so I have to be a little bit more of a spaz. They get pushed by a little bit of invisible force coming out of your thing, so it might be hard to see. Now the dots are really small, which means I have to be kind of tweaky about trying to hit them. It's not easy like it was before. I'm matching colors again. They get big, so you'll notice I have this thing in the lower right corner of the screen that's about showing you what's coming up next in this sort of song that's playing. It's actually really hard to pay attention to that legitimately while you're playing, but so now things are going into a spiral, which sort of changes the mood, and it changes that part of your brain that's engaged about predicting where the dots are going to go, because they had this bouncing pattern for a while, and now they have this like sort of spiraling pattern. So I'm going to go up here and kind of try to block these guys from crossing across. And then this is going to switch into like a last mode, which is about staying as far away from these guys as I can. And I have this halo around me that gets small if I'm too close and big if I'm far. And I get the green sparkles when I'm far. So my goal is to move around. There's a little bit more of that one, but that's all I'm going to show you for now. I found that to be a really cool game. Like, it didn't actually, at the end of that week, I felt that it did not succeed at my goal of feeling like music and would not. It's actually the song that made it feel like music. The patterns of the actual gameplay changed around too slowly in order to really give me that feeling of call and response and stuff. But what I did get out of this was, again, a feeling that I never had out of another game, which was about my intention being shifted between, like, oh, now I'm pushing, oh, now I'm matching colors, now I'm staying away from things. A lot of games do that, but they do it in a sort of less segregated manner. You know, maybe if you're playing a first-person shooter like Counter-Strike, you're shooting guys, right, and you're aiming, and now you're about to run out of bullets, so you go into like a hiding and ducking and reloading mode, right? So games have those mode shifts, but it was a really interesting study to make those explicit and to have nothing else but the mode shifts. And I was really excited by that, and actually, I've done 4 more versions of this game since then. This is probably, the 5th version of this game is probably my next game after Braid, I'm pretty sure. I'm going to show you one more prototype, which I did shortly after that one. And this one is very interesting to me because it was a large-scale prototype. It was a lot harder to do than any of the ones that I've shown you so far. It took 2 weeks to make, but they were really intense weeks. And the reason is because there's this core minute of gameplay like there was in that Raspberry prototype that I showed you, but there's also like a large-scale metagame, and that metagame was crucial in terms of being able, for me, being able to actually judge the playability of the prototype. So this game is called Painter, and what it does is it puts you into the shoes of a painter just straight out of school, and of course all painters, their goal in life is to be famous and get their art displayed in all the galleries around town. So that's what you try to do in this game. Because it's a prototype, it doesn't have the greatest painting interface in the world. You can sort of pick from these colors, of which there is not a full spectrum, and you can sort of scribble. I can change my brush size. I can, I can change from a wet brush to like a medium brush, or maybe a dry brush. So I have some amount of expressivity that might be interesting. And then the goal of this game is to paint things in different ways. And instead of playing through it, which will take a while, I'm going to flip through some slides and show you what it was about. So I wanted this game to be very nonlinear, allow lots of player creativity and choice kind of thing. But at the same time, I wanted to give the players an easy way in to get used to the interface and the way the game works without having to spend all this mental effort like trying to make plans for things that they don't understand yet. So you're an artist first out of school. Nobody in any galleries wants to take your work seriously at all. But you very early on find a patron who's very interested in you copying paintings as well as you can, right? So he'll pay you to do this. And so that's sort of what you do. Because, the colors aren't very good and all that, and because I'm entirely not a painter, this is what my attempt ended up looking like. And he kind of liked it. He said he'd give me $475 for it. And so that's the first stage of the game, is you're just kind of copying things. You don't need to have creativity yet, and you're getting used to the interface. You can advance slightly. This is a speed paint mode, right? Where after you get up to a minute free, and then every second over a minute that you spend duplicating the painting, he'll pay you less, right? So that kind of encourages this sort of frantic scribbling while still trying to be as accurate as possible. And that, that was pretty fun. But then you do enough of that, and those guys know some guys on a board of directors of a gallery that owe them some favors, so you can sort of pay a bribe from the money you've earned and get your work looked at. And this is sort of what the game is meant to be, and the rest of it is sort of training you up to here. There's a bunch of galleries. And each of them has a board of directors, and there's sort of this incestuous thing going on where each director is on the board of multiple galleries, right? So this one has this guy T. Grady and Miller here on the right, and there's another gallery, Gallery Couscous, and he's also on the board there on the left, along with 3 characters who you've never met. And sort of the goal of the game is to figure out what these critics like and get them to accept your work. So the way you play is you submit your painting to one of these galleries, and these guys will vote on it, thumbs up or thumbs down, and they'll accept it or reject it. And so here, 2 of these guys liked my painting, and one of them didn't like it, but that was enough. To get in this gallery, I only needed 2 out of 3, because it's a pretty easy one. So I got in there. And again, the goal is to get your painting accepted in every gallery in the game. Now, I can actually click on any of these thumbs up or thumbs downs, and they'll tell me why they voted that way, right? And this is the heart of the game, which is that each of these critics has different aesthetics that they're judging your painting on, which are, just various image algorithms on a programming level. I painted this sort of garish thing here, and this critic has sort of 2 things to say about it. The first thing is that she has this theory about how when you dip your brush into the paint, it gets a certain amount of energy, but then if you have really long brush strokes while you're painting, you sort of diffuse that energy, and the painting just can't be very emotional or powerful, right? That's sort of her roundabout way of maybe just saying that she doesn't like that you've got so many long brush strokes in here. But she also said a second thing, which is, hey, the colors here really contrast really strongly, and I really love that, right? And what I managed to do was I managed to paint a painting that nailed one of her preferences so well that as a player, I completely understand it now. And I have a dossier for each of these critics, and I have a list of the things that they like and don't like, and they start out as mysteries, but as I unlock them like that, they get displayed to me, and I can refer to them in the future, right? And so I can plot about how to get these people to accept my work. And so you can see of your portfolio what things she's ever commented on and what she thought of them, and it goes the other way around. You can look at something in your portfolio and see all the critics who ever commented. And there was all this, so that was a lot of work to get all that stuff together. And then the end game, where the game changes in character a little bit, is eventually you hopefully have unlocked all those different tastes and opinions that all those critics have, and you've got to try to get into some really hard galleries. Like maybe there's a gallery with 5 people on the board, and you need 4 out of them, but one of them really likes kind of drab, monochrome, gray paintings, and another one likes really colorful paintings, right? Well, what do? Like maybe you say, well, I'm going to make this painting moderately colorful so that both of them kind of like it, and they each have other tastes, like maybe pertaining to the style of brush used and stuff. And I'm going to try to appeal to those other tastes enough that they give me a thumbs up, that they can both give me a thumbs up anyway. Or maybe you say like, oh, screw that first guy, right? I don't need his vote, I only need 4 of the votes, so I'm going to consciously say that I'm just not getting his, and I'm going to appeal to the other 4, right? So this game really appealed to me because it had a lot of opportunity for player choice. And it seemed like a really creative indie game that hadn't been made before. It would be really great to play, and it would be if it was actually fun to play. But the problem that I learned through making this prototype is that it was not, despite being a very compelling game design on paper. And the reason behind that is sort of a tactile thing. Painting is a lot of work, even if you're not trying to paint something that looks great. And the core gameplay of this prototype was that you put a lot of effort into a painting, and then a bunch of people tell you that it sucks, right? And the turnaround time takes a long time. By which I mean, you might form a plan about what you're going to paint for these guys, but then it takes a long time to actually paint that, and then by the time you've done that, you've kind of lost your train of thought about why you painted this specific thing in the first place, and there's no flow. So there's maybe some solutions to that, like making painting more fun, or assisted, or faster, or maybe I can make another game design that has the same metagame with critics and galleries, or something isomorphic to that, but not about painting as the core activity and like something else. I don't know the solution to that, because I mothballed this one. Because I considered that to be too big of a problem to go forward with, again, from prototype into the multi-year development sort of mode. Now, a lot of developers I know would have taken a game like that and would have gone into the multi-year thing and made the game out of it because they would have considered that prototype successful, right? But I'm taking intangible gameplay problems here, like lack of flow, or it kind of sucks to be told your painting sucks. I'm taking them very seriously, and I feel that that's a problem in the industry, is a lot of people don't take them seriously, because this is their baby, right? Like, oh, the gameplay kind of works, and it's hard enough just to get the game done, and they put it out the door, and eventually, their players have to tell them, like, oh, this actually isn't very fun, or the game reviewers have to tell them, oh, 5.0 out of 10, right? But if you really take an objective enough viewpoint, you can catch those things very early, right? I caught that after 2 weeks. What was potentially a very subtle thing to notice, I thought. So how do you pick what game you're going to make, right? My philosophy is, don't do games that are just kind of good or okay. You want to start with a great prototype. It's like, dude, you have to make this game, right? And so be prototyping always. And keep doing it until you find something that you have to make, and that's obviously better than all the other ideas that you have. And don't try to do this on a schedule, because the problem, mainstream game companies say, hey, we're going to have 2 to 4 months for like prototyping, pre-production, whatever, and then we're going to go into like production. And the problem is, maybe you just haven't found the awesome idea after 2 months or 4 months, or maybe it needs more work, and now you've committed yourself into developing this thing when maybe it wasn't the right idea, or maybe you haven't found the right iteration on it. And that can be disastrous. Again, it can mean that your game kind of sucks in the end, or maybe it doesn't suck, but it's not notable. And it takes a long time to get there, right? So prototype while you've got another game going on, and don't commit to ever needing to follow up those prototypes unless you're compelled to. All right. Wow, I'm actually almost on schedule. No, maybe not. Okay, so I said at the beginning of this talk that it was going to be how and why. And most of the time I spent saying a whole bunch of how. I think there was a lot of why implicit in what I was saying. Like, why did I pick exactly these prototypes? So I had some deep core motivations behind those choices I made. So now I'm going to delve into those, because I think this is the key to how we pick what projects we're going to work on, and how we pick like what our careers are like as artists. I hate that word career, but like what our trajectory is going to be through the spaces that we're exploring. Now, why is a delicate subject, right? I can't tell you why you should design games, because it's like your art. Like, your reasons are what makes it yours. What I can do is I can give you some examples of things that I'm exploring that I find compelling, and maybe you'll say, oh yeah, that's kind of interesting, or maybe it'll remind you of something, or maybe you'll think it's stupid, right? At the very least, I want to put further out there the idea that this is a subject that indie gamers should be talking about, at least as much as the how. All right, so this is, from a very personal point of view, why I made these prototypes and Braid, and why I'm still making games now. Throughout my life, I've, ever since I was a kid, I've been concerned with the discovery of deep truths. Like, I didn't want to care about like superficial things in life. I wanted to know, like, hey, I was like 8 and I wanted to know the meaning of life, right? And that never went away. And one thing that compels me about games as opposed to other media is that they're built on systems, right? Whether it's like a simulation, like a physics simulation, or maybe a more formal like rule system with interacting, if A then B. Systems have this bias where they inherently describe truth, provided that you give them axioms that are true, right? They start with a set of axioms or a set of code or whatever, and they just plow forward and say, here's the result of that, here's the result of that, here's the result of that. And the only way that you get something that's not true is if you have some really bad bugs or you intentionally distort or bias them. This is unlike every other form of art, right? If you're writing literature, like you want to write the great American novel or something, and you want to say something really true about human nature, the form of the book isn't going to help you do that. You can put any words down that you want, right? You can put true stuff down, you can put like totally false bullshit down, right? And it's all equally valid in that novel form. With systems, it's not like that. That's kind of exciting. How far can that go? Can that ever say anything really deep? Or are we just talking about truths that are kind of more trivial? I don't know, but that's something I want to explore. And Braid sort of got me hooked on that. And Oracle Billiards, too. If we can set up a system that's kind of like the real world in certain ways, and then make things possible in that system that we'd like to be able to experience in this reality but can't quite, maybe if we do that enough, we can learn something about this reality that we're in. So one thing I was trying to do in Braid was model enlightenment. Like, oh, I'm stuck in the bottom of this pit and there's no way out. And like, what, it's not like a normal puzzle game where I have to do some sequence of 17 different moves to like flip switches in all the right order and stuff. It's like I do one simple thing and I'm out of the pit, and it's like, oh, I understand now, right? That is something I really would love to feel more of in this life here, and I want to explore that through game design, right? I'm going to skip this one because it's too hard to explain. I feel that games are important to the future of humanity in the same way. That sounds like a grand statement, but it's obviously true for other forms of art that we're very familiar with, right? So film and novels have drastically shaped our very society that we live in, and without them, our lives would be very different, right? And other kinds of things too, like, technical books or, nonfiction, right? We all learned out of that kind of books. Our conceptions of humanity sort of come from fiction. The way we visualize things in our head is heavily informed by the language of film. Now, I don't think games are there yet, but I think that if we're good about it, we can develop games into a medium that's more relevant to the wide swath of humanity, in the same way that film and novels are. And I think that that means that we also have to be careful. Because if that's true, if games are able to speak to human nature in the same way, then in the future a lot of people will be playing them. And if a lot of people will be playing them, and it is, I believe, all games teach something, then a lot of people are going to be learning what games are teaching. And I have this great trepidation that games right now teach a lot of the wrong things. And before I start going into that, I'm going to refer you to 2 books that have very different viewpoints on this, but that will back up this idea of like all games teach, right? On the left is Ralph Koster's Theory of Fun for Game Design, and on the right is a book that just came out, Ian Bogost's Persuasive Games. And the reason that I say that all games teach something is that for the most part, well, usually it's really obvious, because they're modeled on giving the player rewards for performing certain kinds of behavior, right? So the game is encouraging some kinds of behavior and discouraging other kinds. That's almost the definition of a game, according to most people. One big problem that I have these days is that that kind of reward system is very easily turned into this sort of Pavlovian or Skinnerian scheme that a lot of people talk about, if you go to mainstream game developer conferences. It's considered like a best practice. Schedule rewards for your players so that they don't get bored and give up on your game. I think that's actually exploitation, and it really bothers me, right? I would rather give a player core gameplay that interests them rather than stringing them along with little pieces of candy so that they'll suffer through the terrible gameplay, but keep playing because they gain levels or new items and stuff, right? So I have a really hard time convincing people of this next point, but I think a lot of modern game design is actually unethical, especially massively multiplayer games like World of Warcraft, because they're predicated on this kind of player exploitation in which, humans have this natural instinct to not do things that are boring or that don't benefit them or that are stagnant, but we override that by plugging into their pleasure centers and giving them scheduled rewards, and we convince them to pay us money and waste their lives in front of our game, in this exploitative fashion. So I don't think that's very good, as an understatement. And I don't see much of a difference looking at these three pictures between the cigarette thing, the junk food thing, and World of Warcraft. They all look the same to me, except they're operating in different planes. The thing about games is it sort of seems like, oh, there's no victim of World of Warcraft. Like somebody just wants to play that, right? And we're giving them what they want to play. That's what cigarette people say too, actually. Because there's an illusion of no victim, it makes games, certain kinds of games, seem unthreatening. But I think if you fast forward into a future society where all kids were weaned on World of Warcraft, man, what did they learn from that? And was it a very good thing? So the question that I have is, as an industry, and I'm speaking of the whole industry, indies and mainstream together, right? Are we propagating the intellectual and emotional version of this picture right here, right? What kind of future are we building? How conscious are we being of that, right? This is a very important question to ask ourselves, and very few people will even broach it. Other things that I aim for, on a more personal level as opposed to a global level, authenticity and connection, right? We all know, or hopefully we know, that games are inherently poor at certain kinds of human factors, like believable characters, that are a huge disadvantage compared to novels that way, because we need AI to respond to the player, and AI just doesn't work, and we don't know how to make it work. But games actually have an advantage over linear media when it comes to the author communicating, or maybe even communing with the audience, right? Because they can provide more of a conversation, because you're able to anticipate maybe things that the player will do and provide reactions. And through those reactions, you can tell the player, hey, I've thought about you. I've thought about the sorts of things you might do, and I've provided, I care about what you're going to do in this realm that I set up, right? So games can be personal and express care. And that sounds like a sort of weird hippie kind of thing to say, but I think it already happens. Remember what I said earlier about leaps of faith, right? It's bad if you let the player lose faith in your level design early. That's actually an example of care or carelessness, but we don't frame it that way, right? If a player feels like they're in good hands in terms of a game design, they'll forgive all sorts of lack of production values and crazy things. My personal commitment in my next couple of games is to be extremely personal and authentic and vulnerable. I want to be so personal, and this is a weird thing, people don't talk about, I'm going to express myself authentically somehow through this game. But that's what I want. I want to be so vulnerable to my audience that my normal social anxieties kick in, and I'll be like, wow, if they play this game, are they going to think I'm creepy? Are they going to think I'm emotionally weak? Or just, what are people going to think? If I can inspire that kind of reaction in myself, I know I'm going in the right direction in terms of game design. And my model for this is this game that there's a screenshot of right now. This may not look like a game, but it is. It's called The Marriage by Rod Humble, and some of you probably have played this. If you haven't, I've talked about a bunch of games during this talk, but if you come away from this talk and decide to download and play one game, let it be this one here. This game, if you care about the future of games as art, this game is very, very important. It's a significant milestone in the development of what it means to express through a game. It's also very simple and a small download, and I can actually probably give you a copy because I have it on my laptop. So those are most of my whys. I have a last one, which I don't know what it is exactly. All the things that I talked about a minute ago all those reasons about like ethics and you know, exploring truth and things like that are really only things that I came to understand in the past couple of years. I was compelled to make games before that, right? And now that I understand those things, I have this personal tendency that when I understand things, I tend to trivialize them. Like, oh, since I understand that pretty well, it can't be that important. You know, I need to chase after this other thing that's like deeper and more important. Well, there's a part of me that doesn't want to be understood and doesn't want to be measured, right? Because if you can understand it or measure it, there's a limit to its depth, and it can't possibly be that important, right? And this is really the source of a lot of my game design. I think that I talked at the beginning about how Flow and Everyday Shooter had a philosophy. I think Braid has a philosophy, and like it's this weird, uncannibal thing here that I don't even understand, but that I tried as hard as I could to put into that game. So I'm going to sum up here. For me, and I think many people will back me up on this, being an indie game artist, especially trying to be a notable one, means traveling a hard road, right? And I'll leave you with a challenge. And the core idea of the challenge is to maybe be a little bit more than independent game developers usually try to be. And I picked some random pieces out of what I was talking about earlier. I could challenge you to be innovative or ethical or personal, but maybe those aren't things that you want to be, right? But maybe you have some ideas about like other values that are more important to you or deeper to you than these. And if you don't want to be challenged to do these, then I challenge you to find that value of yours that is much more important than anything I've talked about and put that into a game and convince me that I want to be challenged by your value, right? Because when we start that kind of exchange, that's when our medium is really going to take off as like something that's deep and meaningful to people. So the reason it's so hard, right? It's way easier to be derivative than it is to be innovative, right? We all know that. It's way easier to be unethical than it is to be ethical. It's tremendously easier to be impersonal or distant, cynical, or uncaring. Most games are cynical or uncaring in some way or another, especially mainstream games. It's way easier to do that than it is to be personal or vulnerable, right? But it's the indie's role to do these things because that's how we differentiate ourselves from the mainstream industry, right? A big company, especially a publicly held company, literally cannot make a game that is personal or authentic. In fact, in the United States, it is against the law, and it probably is in Australia too, because Australia has a lot of similar laws. I'll go into that in QA if anybody cares. It's kind of funny. So I claim that your future audience is thirsty for this kind of extra connection, authenticity, deep motivation, right? They're thirsty for games to be driven by this why, by these philosophies, and not necessarily by the how, or by, hey, this is a really fun game where you shoot stuff and there's cool music, right? In a market full of uninspired games, especially mainstream games that you can't compete with on production value, this is, in a very pragmatic sense, how you get noticed and how you get published and how you make money. So that's all I have to say apart from questions. These are some links that you can look at. The top one, you can download the prototypes that I put up earlier. And the bottom one is a news blog where I cover items about other artful and experimental games. So thanks for your attention, and I'll take questions for the remaining maybe 10 minutes.
Which is good because we can take questions. We probably don't need the mic because it's a smaller room. So can you answer questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to ask about the whole personal games being illegal in the States and in Australia possibly too.
Yeah, okay, so the thing about things being illegal, in America, a publicly held corporation is bound by law that it must do everything in its power to increase shareholder value, right? Because there's been so many like scams and scandals financially. So if you are somehow a steward of a publicly held company and you don't do everything that you can to increase shareholder value, you can be sued, right? Or deposed and all sorts of things like that. So it's a matter of preservation for a publicly held company to do all kinds of due diligence, right? And make sure that this product that we're developing is going to make as much money as it can. And what that means is you can't trust the design of this product to somebody who has some personal ideas about what he would want to communicate to some people, right? Because you know, it's probably going to go out there and flop, and then your shareholders are get complain, and you could get sued, right? So it actually, it's not, I don't think it's a law that necessarily comes into play too often, but I think it's funny. Like, it is technically illegal in America to make authentic games via a publicly held company. Yeah. There.
I wanted to ask about your assessment of your prototypes.
Sure.
You know, what people find educational or entertaining is often surprising. You know, I mean, you're saying the prototype you feel like, or you show it to a few of your friends who are probably within the same subculture. How do you break out of the blend of their own history, I suppose?
Yeah, so in case you can't hear in the back, the question is, how do you really know, I'm trying to summarize, like, how do you know that what you judge was fun or unfun about a prototype is going to be the same that, like, the wider audience might find? And, you know, that's just part of your thing. Like, I feel that I'm not necessarily explicitly designing games for an audience, right? I'm designing games to express the things that I want to express and that embody the things that I care about. And I would really love it if they appeal to a wide audience, because it means I can sell some copies and make enough money to, like, make the next game, right? But if they don't, and the game was important enough to me, that's okay. So in my personal case, I don't necessarily worry about that so much. I just look at my own situation and say, am I really convinced, you know, with feedback from my friends who are it's kind of an incestuous circle of, like, all these game designers who have, like, certain highfalutin notions about what games should be, right? So it's not exactly a representative sample, but I just look at that feedback and I say, is this doing what I wanted it to do, right? And often, usually it didn't, because if you have ambitious goals, usually you're going to fail to some degree or another. And so if you're talking about making a product, that's not what I'm about. It's not what I was really talking about today. So it's a different mode.
Yeah, not necessarily about product, just not making games for other game designers and, you know, make something.
Yeah, well, you know,
something for a lot of people.
for me, if a work is going to embody some of the deep feelings that I was talking about, I have to feel them, right? As long as I feel them, that's okay. Like, that's enough, because I know some percentage of people out there will also. They will respond to that. Even if it's a small percentage, it's still, like, a valid work, right? If I don't feel them, maybe somebody else might feel them and respond to it in the way that I wanted, but it's not going to feel good to me, right? Because it's going to feel kind of fake, like it didn't really work. But other people might have their own opinion about that, right? I don't know. Yeah. Actually, he was first from before, so. Yeah.
I noticed on your earlier prototype of Brady, you had a "Do Not Distribute" notice, and I noticed these ones up here that you're distributing ones you've abandoned. I've noticed a current trend that some developers are actually putting their prototype out there. Like I've been playing a game called Golf Question Mark, which is quite a popular prototype.
By Cryptic Seed, right?
Yeah, we've been playing it at Lands as well. I was just wondering, what are your thoughts on actually putting, you know, viable game development prototypes online and distributing them?
You know, I sort of take that as a case-by-case basis. I didn't distribute the original Braid prototype for two reasons. One is because I really did want to develop it into a game and not endanger that by, like, having people take it and make their own thing. But I wasn't being too secretive, because I then went to all these conferences and talked about it. Like, I was presenting it publicly in 2005, so I obviously wasn't that worried about it. But the other thing about it was I cared a lot about what I was finding in that game. And the outer part of it, like all that lack of production values and crappy controls and stuff, was really getting in the way, right? So I didn't feel, I think the real reason is I didn't feel like that was a good representation of what I wanted the game to be, so I didn't want it to be out there, right? It's also the reason I haven't put out a demo of the current version of Braid. It looks a lot better. A lot of people want a demo, and I'm like, hey, it's not ready yet. It's not quite, it's almost there, but it's not quite there. So yeah, the Cryptic Sea guys, I haven't talked to them in a while. They actually live an hour away from me, yeah, they probably just felt that they wanted people to play their game and have fun. So for everybody it's different.
They're very blatant on their website that here's a prototype of something we eventually hope to charge you for.
Yeah. Did you
Yeah, I was just going to ask, you might have already answered it, but how did you go from, like, showing your friends your game to then getting a deal? Like, was that quite a big...
Yeah, so I approached that at the very beginning of the talk. Maybe you weren't here, maybe I didn't really do it strongly enough, but it bears repeating, right? So there's this whole swarm of, like, normal everyday things that happen, like business concerns and advice that people give you, like, here's how you make a game that really appeals to people, and like, here's how you get a deal, or here's how you, negotiate the terms in your contract and all that. And, all of that stuff only applies to like 95% of games, right? But you don't want to be in that 95%. You want to be in the top 5% that are above those rules, right? You want to be the person where your game is so awesome that like the publisher calls you without you ever having pitched it to them, right? That's what you're aiming for. And if your game is that compelling, then you'll get a deal because you're just differentiated from everybody else. So that sounds like kind of a snide answer, but I fully believe that. Like, that is what everybody in this room should be aiming for, and it is possible.
Do you reckon giving the player the chance to be ethical or unethical, moral or immoral, create or destroy, constitutes being unethical?
Okay. So in case you couldn't hear that, so there's a trend of certain games like, I don't know, Jedi Knight and Black and White and things where you can be good or be evil, or Grand Theft Auto, or you can go beat up people, or you can try to do missions. Is that unethical to give the player the freedom to explore those things and be evil and whatever? I don't think so, but it's not something that I've thought very deeply about because that's not the kind of game that I've made. So I might go make a game like that. I think if I made it, it would be pretty different from any of those games that I made. But at the same time, I'm saying this not having done it and not having come face to face with that. And maybe if I did, I would decide, like, ooh, I really don't want to make this game. Maybe. I don't know. I do think, again, so a game like Grand Theft Auto, 3 or 4, is inherently cynical, like I was saying, right? They're not trying to present, like, here's what it really feels like to be a human who kind of lives as this rough guy on the streets and goes around and, like, rips off cars and beats up hookers. It's trying to present to you, hey, it's cool to be like this gangsta who runs around and, like, rips off cars and beats up hookers. And it's a very different thing, right? I think if somebody in this room made authentic Grand Theft Auto, like, dude, you would so have a deal, it would be amazing, right? But for some reason, nobody does that. Nobody wants to come at these games from this place of authenticity because we have these years or maybe even decades of cynicism and distance. And that's built into our tradition, and we have to work hard to overcome that, I think, way in the back.
There was one point that you skipped over in your talk.
Oh, yeah.
Would you mind touching on it at all?
Yeah, so one of the things that I care about, and I could talk about this one for like 3 hours. I have some hobbies besides games, martial arts and certain kinds of dancing. And so I think a lot about mind-body integration and what it means to intend to do something and what the process is between that intent and the actions that your body performs and its effect on the environment and then the environment's effect on you, right? And how that travels back into your perceptions, right? And so there's this field of that called somatics, and it's actually, that word stands for a ton. There's a lot of different things that are all called somatics. I find it to be a really interesting subject. That game that I showed with the dots moving around and stuff was an early exercise in that. It was like, what happens when we shift the player's intention back and forth, and how does that feel? And that felt really cool. Another thing that wasn't quite in that game, but that I find fascinating in conjunction with that, is the idea of proxied embodiment, which is that when you get used to using a tool, like say you drive a car, you call them cars in Australia? Yes, I honestly don't know. Like, say you drive a car all the time, right, and you're used to it, you don't have to think about the fact that you're in this car and you're controlling the car, right? Like the car kind of becomes an extension of your body and you're moving this bulkier thing around, right? That's a proxy for your body. And according to somatics, right, you have some process by which you interoperate with that proxy. And the thing that fascinates me about this is that your avatar in the game world is also a proxy for your body, but it's an imaginary one, and you can control, as a game designer, the rules about that. So I think that the game design field is ripe for some somatics exploration that nobody has ever even thought about. Like, what does it mean to have this chain of intention and response that goes through a computer into it and comes back out? Yeah. Yeah.
I read that you started developing games in '96.
Yes.
So you've developed a few. My question is, when do you stop developing a game? Because I've been working on a game for a few years, and there's so much to do. So is that when you find that the game isn't popular enough or you don't get the attention of publishers?
So is it, what kind of game is it? Can you, just like what genre or?
An audio, video, adventure game?
Adventure game?
Online, yes.
So you mean like a role-playing game or like a?
3D objects, all the graphics, the GUI development,
Yeah,
videos, and the work is endless. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, you can develop a few games, and where do you stop? Because I don't see an end to what I'm doing. There's constantly work.
Yeah, that's a hard question. Where do you stop? Where do you give up on a game, essentially, and go to the next idea? My preference was very early, like after 1 or 2 weeks, right? Obviously, it's too late for that. But again, that's almost a product question, right? And I'm trying to stay away from product questions. I think like, hey, if you totally believe in this game and you think it's a really great thing, put it on the internet for like $10 and let people buy it. And maybe not that many people buy it and you don't make any money and that sucks. But then you've got some closure and can move on to the next thing, right? Or there's some places like Steam, the guys at Valve Software put up games for download. They're not necessarily that good at getting indie game customers, but you could try that. Like when I started in '96, you had to go through a traditional publisher route. You couldn't really sell things on the internet. Now it's kind of viable, and people make money doing it. So I would say, when you feel the game is good enough that it holds interest for your audience, whatever that means, just pull the cord on it.
You seem to come from the visual art background.
I actually don't. I have no art education at all. It's just kind of what I'm interested in.
Yep.
Yeah.
So, when you do painting or any artwork, you sort of have to make a decision, okay, that's it, and the work is over. There's new trends where you don't necessarily do artwork for the sake of making it a material object. So in the virtual world or the digital creations, then there's not necessarily an end to our artwork.
Absolutely. That's a hard kind of game to be working on, right? You picked a difficult one. Back in the middle.
How do you go about choosing the artists you did to read, and how do they affect your design and your development process?
Yeah, I could give like a 4-hour talk on that. So I looked for a long time trying to find artists. I really cared a lot about this game, right? The art had to be good, and it had to work with the game, and man, it's really hard to find that. Like I had a bunch of money saved up, and I was willing to pay people like contract art rates, and I still wasn't able to get 2D art of a reasonable quality. And I think the main reason is the whole industry has moved on to like 3D, so 2D skills aren't really out there anymore, or people who have 2D skills are working full-time and they don't want to contract. But, I did stuff like I posted on, maybe Craigslist isn't big here, but it's this thing in the States where you can post ads, and I posted on message boards like indiegamer.com saying, hey, I'm looking for artists, and people would email me, and I would say, here's a scene from the game that's all built out of blocks and programmer art. Spend 1 day or 2 days, and I'll pay you to just do a concept of this as a forest scene, and give me back this screenshot of showing me how you would make this game look. And by the way, here's a few paragraphs describing the mood and things that I'm going for. And I did that like with 30 different artists or something. And I even went more forward than that with a few of them. Like I would start working with an artist for a few weeks or a month, paying them to work on the game before deciding like they really don't get it. They don't get this game and their art isn't right. And eventually, someone just happened to refer to me, a really good world artist and character artist, and it worked. But I got lucky. Like, I could have just had to settle for something. In fact, I at one point went to an art house and spent a great deal of money contracting them to like churn out the art in a month, because I just wanted to be done with the game, and like, it really sucked. It was like terrible, and I was like, no, this can't be the game. So, very early on in the beginner part, I was encouraging people to be able to go forward and do what they can by themselves. And I do encourage that to the greatest extent possible. I didn't have the visual art skills to do the art to this game and feel good about it, which is why I wanted to go to somebody else. But man, it was a big problem. And if you can make a whole game yourself, it's really preferable, because you don't have that problem. I would be a lot richer right now if I had art skills. That was a long answer, sorry. But so I'm going to need someone to cut me off when there's too many questions.
We'd like to wrap up now, but you can see Jonathan in a couple of panels' time here in the Independence Day panel. So again, if everyone could just thank Jonathan for
Oh yeah, totally. I just come up and say hi, and I'm totally willing to talk about all this stuff.
And we'll reconvene in 10 minutes time for the MBA session. The workshop panel is about to start downstairs at 11 o'clock as well.